I'm Will Beecham, ICIS Chemical Business Deputy Editor, and I'm here with Paul Hodges, the Chairman of International Echem. Hello, Paul.
Hello, Will.
So, Paul, you've written an outlook piece for the magazine for January of next year, and you talk about how we're going to return to real supply and demand fundamentals. This is to do with central banks' realisation that stimulus isn't working anymore. I just wondered why you think they've come to that realisation and what's driving that.
I suppose the simple answer, Will, is that they've tried 8 years of stimulus and all we've ended up with is a vast amount of debt. So at a certain point, you have to give up. And I think the Brexit and Trump combination have meant that central banks are now sort of moving into the background, really, and we're going to move into quite a different world, this new normal world that we've been talking about.
In terms of new normal world, could you explain a bit about what that means?
Well, essentially, the good news has been that over the last sort of 50 years or so, we've got an extra 10 years of life expectancy across the world. And in the Western world, instead of retiring and dying at around the age of 65, at the age of 65, you've now got an average 20 years life expectancy. Now, that's very, very good news, obviously. But the corollary of that is that if you have an aging population, which is what we do today in the West and across much of the world, well, older people already own most of what they need. They don't need to buy very much. And so effectively what you've done is you've traded 10 or so years of extra life expectancy for economic growth. I've talked about this meetings, chemical industry meetings all around the world. I've never had anybody put their hand up and say, I'll tell you what, I'd like to go back to having the growth instead. Everybody's happy with this. And finally, the central banks, interestingly, the Fed itself, the US Federal Reserve, actually came out with a paper confirming this back in October last year. It's just a great pity that it took 8 years for this to happen.
And that's despite the fact that we've got the rising middle class, and in emerging regions, the consensus seems to be that the future growth prospects are quite rosy. Do you disagree with that? Well,
I think this illusion of rising middle class in the developing world is just wishful thinking. And what we're talking about, if you go down into the detail of what the central banks are talking about when they talk about rising middle class, they talk about people earning between $5,000 and $10,000 a year, and that's only a very small number. Now, $5,000 and $10,000 a year would put you in the poverty level in the West. These are not middle class people by Western standards. It's a complete and utter fabrication. And an awful lot of money has been wasted because people tried to pretend that a great success, which is that a vast number of people have moved out of poverty. They've moved out from earning $1 a day to $2.50 a day to $5 a day. That is a fantastic achievement over the last 20 years, but they have not become middle class, and they won't become middle class even if current trends continue for another 40 or 50 years by Western standards, because in Western standards we're talking about incomes of $40,000 or $50,000. We're not talking about incomes below $10,000.
Okay, so if the emerging markets and mature markets aren't going to be big drivers of demand, can you put a figure or some sort of idea of what kind of GDP growth we could expect next year and beyond?
Well, I think the sad truth, or just the truth, is that we need to move ourselves away from GDP. If you go back before the super cycle started, before we had this surge of baby boomer driven economic demand from the middle 1980s onwards, nobody ever thought about GDP. Nobody ever thought about, well, is polyethylene going to be 1 times GDP or 1.1 times? It was very different. As you said at the start, Will, it was about supply and demand. I think I'd like to build a plant. Where would I like to build it? Can I get a customer to sign a contract with me? And can that customer get a first-class bank to guarantee it? That's how we used to do projects in the past. That's how we used to do capital expenditure. That's how we used to do our growth forecasts. And I think that's where we've gone back to that. So the idea, it was a very convenient shortcut, and I ran businesses that benefited from it. I'm not saying it was a bad thing. I'm just saying it doesn't exist anymore. I don't know what GDP is going to be next year. I rather fear it's going to be very weak indeed. The data from the American Chemistry Council is suggesting that chemical industry capacity utilization is almost as low as it was back at the bottom of the disaster in 2008, 2009. That's not a very healthy position as we start the year.
Do you foresee that that could be an indicator of a significant downturn ahead then? If it's as bad as at that point in history?
I would honestly suggest to everybody that you take as your base case a recession in 2017. Obviously, it will be much better if it proves to be wrong, and it's much easier, of course, if things do turn out to be a bit better than one fears, to turn up the wick, as it were, and go for a bit of growth. But really, there are so many flashing red lights around the global economy. You look at obviously what's happening in the chemical industry itself. You look at the disruption caused by the coming trade battles that are going to be going on in 2017. You look at the debt problems in China. You look at the currency reform issues in India. All these things say to you, we will be very, very lucky indeed if we get through this without at least one of these shoes dropping and causing a downturn.
Just coming back to protectionism, which you mentioned, that's, I would have thought, going to have quite a long-term impact, structural impact on the chemical industry.
Yes, I mean, you can look at
globalization.
You can look at it in several different ways. The way I would suggest we look at it is that globalization was essential and a very successful policy when you have lots and lots of young people, because you need more stuff. Young people are leaving college, they're leaving school, they're starting jobs, they're settling down perhaps, they're having children, and all the time they're earning more and more, they're going up the career ladder, and they're having, they need more stuff. So more and more supply is needed, and they can afford to pay for it. So globalization works fantastically. Today, with aging populations, you don't need lots and lots of stuff at all, as we were saying. Instead, what you need is sustainability. And sustainability is going to be the key driver for the next 25 years, just as globalization was in the past. In other words, doing more with less. The circular economy. Can we take, at the moment, we only reuse 5% of all the plastics we produce. So we produce over 300 million tons a year of plastics in the world, and we only reuse 5% of it. And a large part of it ends up in the sea, and it cannot go on like that. So recycling, the circular economy, and this therefore means that business models for the chemical industry have to change.
Could you give us a few pointers then about the kind of emerging business models that you foresee?
Yeah, and people can say, oh, this is awful, this is terrifying, and so on. In one sense it is, but on the other hand, it's an opportunity. The world never stays still, it moves forward. And there are new opportunities. As one door closes, another door opens. So the globalization door closes, sustainability door opens. So what we need to be doing is thinking, and let's just take Uber as an example. What are we seeing there? We're not seeing lots of young people rushing out to buy cars. In fact, in the States, we're seeing only sort of 4 out of 5 young Americans actually bothering to get a driving license anymore. But that doesn't mean they don't want to be mobile. It just means they don't want to be buying a car at $30,000 and using it for an hour or two a day. It's a ridiculous waste of money and resources. Instead, what they need is car sharing, autonomous vehicles, all these new business models. And we can see that developing. If you take the pharma industry, for example. Pharma industry is moving away from blockbuster drugs, $1 billion and so on, to personalized medicine, where you go into your doctor, they do genetic testing, and then you go next door to the pharmacist to get the drug that's right for your genetic makeup. It's a much more personal, much more local, and keeping product in the supply chain rather than just throwing it away for it to end up in the oceans and poisoning fish and so on. So it's a different way forward, but very, very interesting and very profitable for companies that get it right.
How can a chemical company capitalise on that change in the way industrial production is going to take place?
Well, several ways. Several ways, I think. Will one way is simply to start to rethink and do pilot projects where you move to smaller, more local scale manufacturing. And as you know, I'm chairman of a company that operates in this area, Nitec Solutions, and we're working with over a dozen major chemical companies now in this area. So there's real momentum developing in this area for continuous local process and manufacturing. A second area that you can move forward to is just take all the expertise that we have in the business and put that together as a new value proposition. How do we use that research and that production and that marketing, and that distribution, logistics skills to create more value for the customer? That's the key thing, because they don't necessarily just want stuff anymore. They just don't want molecules. They want the value from that, the mobility, the shelter. These are the areas where we need to move forward on. And again, there are many companies now that are actively moving forward in this area. So I'm quite encouraged by what's happening.
Thank you very much, Paul.
Thank you, Will.